The Internet Society DC chapter. I also work for Cloudflare and occasionally teach at Georgetown. Very glad you can be here for another in a series of discussions we've had here at the Microsoft Innovation and Policy Center. I want to thank Paula Boyd for helping arrange this, and also want to announce that our next session here at Microsoft with the Internet Society will be on November 20th, when we'll be doing a recap of the Internet Governance Forum. We have a very special program today. Blair Levin, who led the team that wrote the National Broadband Plan a few years back, is now here to give us an update on where broadband is in America, and we have two excellent respondents who will spark a discussion with all of you. This is meant to be an audience participation event, so be thinking of questions that you might have for Blair and for the other speakers as we go along. So with that, Blair, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Oh, that's right. There is a webcasting audience, and if you want to be part of the conversation, just put up questions on Twitter at #IPFBroadband. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Paula, for hosting us. Thank you all for coming for what I hope will be a very lively discussion on broadband competition. We're following up three important speeches by Chairman Wheeler, FCC General Counsel Salad, and Assistant Attorney General or Antitrust Division Chief Baer, which made a number of policy pronouncements and kind of regulatory approaches and approaches to mergers. My comments are somewhat covering the same topic, but in a somewhat different way. They are more of a progress report since what's happened with the plan. They're also derived more from game theory and from lessons I learned in government, not just with the plan, but as Chief of Staff to the FCC in the '96 Act, as well as with working with certain broadband competition initiatives, specifically Gig.U and Republic Wireless, so there's some other things I've been working on that are also related to this. I should note that a version that's about twice as long as the remarks I'm going to give is up on the website so that I could kind of fill in what I will pass over very quickly here. But I'm going to start with my bottom line, which is that the highest priority for government broadband competition policy ought to be to lower input costs for adjacent market competition and network upgrades. Today I'll argue for that bottom line and illustrate by pointing to where policy has the opportunity to create a virtuous cycle of upgraded mobile stimulating low-end broadband upgrades, in turn causing an upgrade of higher-end broadband, which by using its assets to enter mobile can accelerate the need for mobile to upgrade, creating a virtuous cycle that I think would be in the country's interest. So here's how I get to that bottom line. I start with three questions. What do we want broadband competition to accomplish? Where does broadband competition come from? And given the current market, what are the appropriate government levers to intensify competition? As to the first, I would start by saying that the '96 Act sought competition in all communications markets, but most of the debate focused on producing a single outcome in the voice market, and that was lower prices. Broadband is very different. There are a number of variables we wish broadband to deliver. The two most prominently discussed are lower prices and improved performance, but there are others. Optimizing for multiple factors makes policy calls more complex. Different policies can deliver better outcomes as to some metrics and worse outcomes as to others, and that requires trade-offs. This makes, in my view, competition more important as our competition can optimize for multiple factors according to consumer preferences more adroitly than a policy process. Now, my own view of what we want competition to deliver is the elimination of bandwidth as a constraint to innovation, economic growth, and social progress. Further, I believe that goal is likely to be achieved only when there are at least two next-generation networks capable of delivering all foreseeable needs for the next decade at least, and with a viable upgrade path. With only one such network, economic forces will likely price the marginal use of bandwidth at a level that constrains growth and progress. Thus, we need multiple networks upgraded. In short, we want competition to help move us from today's world, which I think is where the dominant business model is how to allocate scarce bandwidth, to one where competition is over the best deployment of abundant bandwidth. Second, where does competition come from? There are two related answers. The first goes to the nature of competitive enterprises, and the second involves an economic equation, or at least as much of an equation as an American studies major like me can do. There are 4 kinds of enterprises capable of intensifying competition: existing players and new entrants, which come in 3 varieties: greenfield new entrants, adjacent market entrants who bring asymmetric assets and interests, and entrants who depend on inputs sold on a wholesale basis. But all 4 follow a similar economic pattern. First, intensified competition always requires a new capital allocation decision by one of those 4 kinds of enterprises. My guess is that my conservative friends are nodding, my progressive friends are a little bit nervous, but as a factual matter, we should all agree that intensified competition in communications has to follow a company shifting its capital allocation from one purpose to the purpose of providing or upgrading a communication service. A second pattern is that new capital allocation decisions follow a change in the same formula. So ask yourself, why don't we have more intense competition now? And the answer is a formula, which if we had the slides, I would be showing you. But it's simply, we can? Oh, how wonderful. Show the formula. It's CapEx plus OpEx is greater than risk-adjusted revenues plus system benefits plus the threat of competitive losses. That is, the reason we don't have greater competition now is that the new or incremental capital and operating expenses of a network capable of intensifying competition are greater than those risk-adjusted new or incremental revenues, plus the benefits to the overall system, plus the risk of lost revenues to competition. So if we want to intensify competition, we have to change that math, causing, where possible, CapEx, OpEx, and risk to go down, revenue system benefits, and competitive threats to go up. And third, historically, the biggest changes in the competitive landscape in communications result from changes in which the formula, which themselves result directly from changes in government policy. Oh, do I get it back? Cool. That's interesting. I don't want anyone here to blame Microsoft. That would be bad. I'm sure it was something I did in the PowerPoint.
It's obviously Google because you use Google.
I don't think I think I won't tell you who I was using, but I'm not sure. Anyway, but that's basically the formula, and this is something we've talked a lot. This actually comes out a lot of the Google Fiber project and the Gig.U project. But I think if you look at all the big changes, they always follow government policies which affect the equation on at least one of those metrics and often on several. Cable intensified competition with broadcast following new pole attachment copyright rules. DBS and telcos intensified multi-channel video competition after rules granting non-discriminatory access to programming or the elimination of franchise monopolies. Wireless began competing with wireline when the government both created more competition with spectrum auction and, in the most underrated decision ever, lowered the terminating access price from wireless to wired. Cable began competing with telco when the program access rules that I mentioned forced it into a much more competitive situation in which they would lose to DBS if they didn't have another industry line. And of course, Google has decided to devote more capital to its fiber projects when cities expressed a willingness to reform construction-related and other regulations that fundamentally address 5 out of the 6 of those. And in turn, the telcos responded by doing what they had said previously they wouldn't do, going into fiber. And that's causing Comcast and the other cable folks to accelerate their deployment of 3.1, DOCSIS 3.1. So this demonstrates how policy affects capital allocation and competition. They also suggest not all 4 categories are equal in producing long-term competitive effects. Blair praised online video distribution as disruptive innovation. I certainly agree about the value of disruptive as opposed to traditional competition. Indeed, after some period of time, markets tend to stabilize, and it's difficult to affect the incentives of existing players without introducing a new competitor or technology substitute. For example, that decision on wireless to wired, terminating access, and a similar decision that allowed VoIP to essentially connect without terminating access charges is the reason why, whereas 20 years ago we were discussing extensively a price per minute on long distance. No one has talked about price per minute, with the one exception of prisons, which is actually kind of interesting. But anyway, I disagree with the nomenclature Bear used. I don't really see them as new entrants. Rather, they're adjacent market entrants. That is, they had assets and motives very different than the traditional players. And the last 20 years, I think, suggests the asymmetry of those assets and motives, if unleashed in an adjacent market, leads to far greater disruptions than existing competitors or new entrants in a mature market are likely to cause. And similarly, Google Fiber could be seen as a new entrant. People mostly characterize it that way. The truth is they had a lot of existing assets in terms of network assets to lower its cost structure. And they also had motive to improve search revenues and YouTube performance through better broadband performance. With Gig.U, I should note, we worked with some true new entrants or greenfield new entrants, and those efforts failed. And as we discussed in a handbook we published this summer, efforts involving greenfield new entrants have a much higher likelihood of failure for a variety of reasons. And so I think regulators should be cautious about making regulatory policy that bets on such entrants and instead prioritize strategies that enable asymmetric adjacent market entry. Similarly, I'm concerned about unbundled strategies, which can absolutely work to reduce prices, but discourage investments in an upgrade or quality improvement. We can chat more about that, I'm sure. So in short, in answer to this question, if we want intensified competition to deliver abundant bandwidth, we should evaluate how government affects that equation today with particular attention to how it can incent adjacent market entry. Well, that leads to our third question, which do I have a clicker at all? Oh, okay. No, that's actually the least important. So now I'm going to go back to 2009, and what we saw there was we saw three broadband markets. You could characterize them as one that looked to us like three different ones. One is a high-speed wired broadband market generally characterized by a single provider cable. A second, that's not true in Ohio's territories, but for about 75% of the country it was true. Oh, you do have those? Oh, no, don't worry about that. A low-speed wired market generally characterized by a single-player telco, and a mobile market generally characterized by at least 4 players. Some would argue it's a single market, and certainly there is some price impact. But I would just note that all the three government officials I noted saw high-end and low-end as separate markets. Some might also argue that wireless competes with wires. Bill Baer directly addressed that in noting that, quote, today wireless is too capacity constrained and costly to provide a meaningful alternative to consumers. Now, I'm not, Hal might have better answer than me in terms of an economist answer to whether they should be seen as a single market or three separate ones. But I'm going to tell you how we kind of looked at it with the plan, and that brings us to the game theory. So when we looked at the data, we realized that for the first time since the beginning of the commercial internet, there was no national provider with plans to deploy a better network than the current best available network. So the data suggested, and experience actually confirmed, that the current market forces would not drive deployment of a world-leading wireline network in the United States. For 75%, as I noted, cable had both the fastest network and the cheapest upgrade path. So the future looked like a cable versus copper competition, which would be premised on allocating scarce bandwidth instead of building on technological advances to deploy abundant bandwidth. So in thinking about the movement from scarcity to abundance, we started thinking about the prisoner's dilemma. Classic game theory, you all probably know, prisoners are both better off if they don't talk, but that requires them to trust each other not to talk. The cop wants them to talk, but to do so must cause a defection. So if you substitute the idea of talking with investment, you ask yourself, do cable and telco trust each other not to invest in next generation networks? Because if they do, they're both economically better off by harvesting their existing past investments. But if society wants to remove bandwidth constraints on innovation, economic growth, and social progress, we have to cause a defection. And that brings us to what I think of as the core dynamic, intensifying competition between the three adjacent markets to drive each to invest in more abundant bandwidth. So our first thought was consistent with Baer's point, which was remove capacity constraints by providing the wireless sector with more spectrum. Not only is it good in and of itself, it negates the telco's harvest strategy and therefore changes the capital allocation decision for both wireless and the telco sectors, improving the economics of the upgrade and by increasing competition, increasing the motive for the telcos to upgrade. Plan made many recommendations. A number of them actually were adopted. But there are two problems, or actually there are more, but I'll just talk about two problems with that as a strategy. First, it takes a long time. And second, the two largest wireless providers are also the two largest fixed line providers, and so the incentives are not quite as pure. And that doesn't mean you don't proceed. It just means you have to be realistic about the timing and the impact if that was your sole strategy to drive the upgrade. So then we looked at the second leverage point, which was improving the economics of a telco upgrade. We made a number of proposals at that time, but as it turns out, cities actually have greater leverage to improve the math. This has been made clear by not just the Google Fiber project, but also by the Gig.U project that I've been involved with. But the Google project, which came out of discussions of the plan, has been the principal driver of what we love to think of as the game of gigs. It's highly unlikely to cover the entire country, however, though I would note they just announced another 3, which is great. But Bernstein, the equity research firm, I think said at the end of 6 to 8 years, the most they will do, the most aggressive would be about 20 million homes, I think. It's in the written version. But as we discussed in the handbook we published this summer, a lot of other communities are doing a lot of other things. So it's not just Google. They all come down to the same basic strategies of asset utilization and improvement, regulatory flexibility to accommodate new business models and demand aggregation. And there's a lot of details in that book, but we shouldn't let the federal government off the hook. Indeed, there are a number of now legislative efforts, such as the Dig Once bill introduced by Representatives Walden and Eshoo, that's quite consistent, though I think it actually improves on the Dig One recommendation in the plan. There was also a hearing this week, and it's interesting because it got a lot of bipartisan support for a number of things that the federal government should be doing to follow that better asset utilization and improving assets. I certainly agree with those things, and actually it's remarkable how many of them were kind of in the plan, and it raises an interesting question of why there wasn't such a hearing right after the plan was released, but I'll leave that for another time. Part of the answer, by the way, was the Comcast case came out, and the 8th floor at the commission could not focus on simultaneously implementing the plan and dealing with net neutrality. It was complicated. But in any event, I think based on the experiences I've had, pole attachments is a much bigger issue than even though we had 5 recommendations about it. It's an even bigger issue. And cities should be looking at accelerating competition by updating their as-built within the poles. The federal government could also do something related to that. We're actually getting into a situation where lots of delays in construction are being caused by not just Google, but also AT&T and also some others wanting to upgrade at the same time. So we actually have a really interesting, it's a high-class problem of in certain areas too much upgrading, and that kind of delays everybody. So those are the first 2 levers, that they provide telcos 2 incentives to upgrade, better economics for deployment of upgraded networks, and the threat of new competition, and both put pressure on cable to upgrade. The third level actually stems, I kind of had a notion of it, but it didn't really realize it until the summer of 2011. I was talking with a friend, the CEO of a company named Bandwidth.com. My friend is David Morkin, who's the founder and the CEO. And he suggested that his company use their existing assets to launch a Wi-Fi-based mobile service. I actually first thought he was crazy, but within a short period of time he converted me. And shortly thereafter, the company launched Republic Wireless, which is today the largest Wi-Fi first mobile company. But ask yourself the following question, which was part of the reason I thought he was crazy, but he was right. How can a company with a couple hundred employees in North Carolina develop and deliver a product that the cable companies with far greater capital and far greater number of employees has not yet done? And the answer is motive. They had the means and the opportunity, they didn't have the motive. Why would Comcast attack a market that might cause a counterattack, reducing prices throughout all broadband markets? The logical path is not to attack, but rather to focus on harvesting existing networks until one is forced to attack. If, however, there are sufficient forces threatening cable's existing revenue streams, it will, as it did when DBS threatened their multi-channel video revenue stream, attack new markets. Alternatively, if enough players like Republic enter the space and wireless providers seek new revenue streams by aggressively pursuing cord cutting in the broadband market. Cable will enter the mobile market because the game is already afoot. And indeed, with Verizon and AT&T ramping up competition in the video market and over-the-top threatening as well as folks like Republic and others entering the Wi-Fi space, you now see Comcast more aggressively pursuing its mobile strategy, and I suspect the other cable guys will follow. And this will, in turn, intensify competition in all three markets. So that third lever requires a couple of elements. Government must assure unlicensed continues to have sufficient spectrum and doesn't suffer degradation. And there has to be enough of competition within the mobile market to enable a wholesale market. So summarizing my answer to the three questions, if we understand that what we want is to remove bandwidth constraints to innovation, growth, and social progress, we want policy to create incentives for competitive upgrades. For policy to play that role, it must drive changes in capital allocation and the economics of deployment. To do that, policy should look to where it can lower input costs for all potential competitors, but particularly for adjacent market entrants. And here, policy should assure that all three submarkets have the means, motive, and opportunity to enter the adjacent market, as that will create the competitive virtuous cycle that drives toward bandwidth abundance. Let me just close with this. Last month, Jeff Greenfield in the New York Times sought to explain the explosion of great television this way. When technology replaced scarcity with abundance, every core assumption about TV began to crumble. Everything about the medium, how we receive it, how we consume it, how we pay for it, how we interact with it, has been altered, and TV is infinitely better for it. The purpose of broadband competition is to cause the same explosion of abundance with bandwidth, and I actually think we're much better off than we were 5 years ago. And I think we'll see that more clearly in a couple of years. But if we can stay focused on the key leverage point, we can create bandwidth abundance, and our country will also be infinitely better off for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Blair. Thank you very much, Blair. Now we'll turn to the two discussion leaders who will get things going and respond to some of the points that Blair has made. Our first respondent is Jim Baller. He is the president of Baller Stokes and Lead, which is a law firm here in Washington and in Minneapolis. They represent telecom companies and municipalities around the country. He's also been the founder of the Coalition for Local Internet Choice, working with a number of cities that are deploying their own broadband, and he formed the U.S. Broadband Coalition, more than 160 different organizations, all working together to promote broadband around the world, around the country. So over to you, and again, I hope we will have questions at the end of the three speakers.
Thank you. First of all, could I get some help with time? I have 8 minutes, and I would be grateful if someone waved at me at about 6. You'll do that? Okay, I see. All right. I've been a friend and admirer of Blair's work for many years, and over the years I've seen his papers and presentations always filled with a broad range of historical and current information, as well as trenchant insights and policy observations. I'm going to be commenting not just on what Blair said today, but on some of the major points in the backgrounder that he has given, because I tend to agree with almost everything that Blair has said, but I see the world through slightly different eyes. My perspective is one that, from the perspective of one who works primarily with local governments in their capacity as trustees of public rights-of-way and assets, and also as providers or facilitators of affordable, ubiquitous access to high-capacity broadband. And most of you know this has been a year in which there's been a great deal of attention and interest among local governments and others on developing or getting access to gigabit networks. And I'd like to start by explaining why that's the case, because this is critically important as a backdrop to what I'm going to say later. Think of what local governments have considered important for decades, for centuries, time immemorial. economic development, education, healthcare, transportation, energy, environmental concerns, and on and on. All of these areas today can be driven, supported, and facilitated simultaneously over advanced communications networks, all of them at the same time. And we know that the world is rapidly developing in all of these areas. Like there was a big bang, and progress is happening in all of those areas, and communities need access to the networks in order to get the benefits of that progress. So that's how I see the world. And so when I hear that Blair's central thought here today is that the highest priority for broadband competition policy ought to be to lower input costs for adjacent market competition and network upgrades, my personal reaction is that it is and should be a priority, but it shouldn't be the only one, and it isn't necessarily, at least to me, the highest priority. Now, Blair does not claim that it ought to be the only one, and he, in fact, in his paper does underscore several of the things that I will talk about, but that it's on that level that we disagree. And when Blair talks about cable competing with telco, competing with wireless, competing with over-the-top users, I can see those from a high policy level, but the world I see primarily is down at the project level, and it isn't cable competing with telco in a grand scheme. At the project level, the adjacent markets are competitors and make entry more difficult. So as wireless, for example, moves from what it originally was, basically BlackBerries, to 3G, 4G, and wherever it goes, it makes it more difficult for competitors to enter the market and succeed. This does not necessarily mean that fiber and wireless are head-to-head competitors in a major way, but if you're looking at the take rates you need from the market, and you lose a group here that's satisfied with the cable company's offering, and you lose another portion to wireless, pretty soon you have a challenging business case, a more challenging business case, and you need to find other ways to be successful by driving more deeply into healthcare applications, educational applications, and other substitutes than you might have done before. And so, this should certainly, to me, not be the only priority, given what the goals of local governments are, but we should also be doing other things that are critically important. We should remove barriers, state laws and other kinds of barriers that deter or prevent local governments from participating in their markets, either as providers of service or partners in public-private partnerships, which are expanding greatly across the country now. Facilitating access to rights-of-way, that's happening all across the country, but it's very complicated, more complicated than you might think. Someone with, let's say, Google coming into the market, a community may be very eager to enter into arrangements that work for Google, but non-discrimination requirements would require them to bestow similar benefits to others. Are others similarly situated? We might say no, they will certainly say yes. So a decision to provide a benefit here might have implications that are much more significant across the board than might immediately seem present. Access to apartment buildings and other what we call multiple dwelling unit buildings. These can be 25, 35, 40% of some urban markets, and if an incumbent has tied them up in a gauntlet of exclusivities, a new entrant can effectively be unsuccessful before even laying the first foot of fiber in the community. So we need to be aware of that. We need to look at the legal constraints around access to MDUs. Content. We currently have multiple barriers in getting access to content through a very complex retransmission consent regime, through programming access rules and others. Those need to be fixed. Incumbents often engage in behaviors that from the outside looking in sometimes appear to be predatory, sometimes at the very least reflect targeted rate discrimination. There used to be rules that dealt effectively with those situations. We need to think about restoring them. The Broadband Opportunity Council at the federal level has just conducted a process of getting 25 departments of federal government to look into themselves and see what they are currently capable of doing to be more supportive of broadband. Thank you. And what more authority they need to be supportive of broadband, what practices they've engaged in, historical or otherwise, that constrict what others outside the federal government can be doing. States should be doing the same thing. They should be emulating that process. And then I have to do this, of course, for my partner, Sean Stokes, who believes that everything in life can be related within 3 steps to pole attachments to address to address Blair's point that we need to do something about pole attachments. This is one area in which I fundamentally disagree with Blair and with the National Broadband Plan and with the FCC. Certainly we ought to be doing something about pole attachments, but it may not be what you might think. I would suggest that one problem with our pole attachment rules is they are exactly wrong in that the rules are cost-based, as they should be, but they don't let utilities recover their full costs. So if the issue is incenting faster, incenting more cooperation, why would you rush to lose money if you can't recover your costs? That's a fundamental fact, and economists would typically say if you want to encourage action, you have to offer some positive. Well, I'll pause at that point, and I understand we'll get a chance to dive more deeply into some of these points.
I'm glad both Blair and you mentioned pole attachments. That was part of my introduction to the intricacies of FCC regulations when I first arrived there 15 years ago. I learned that different wires got charged different rates for connecting to the same pole. And they've only gotten more complicated since then. Our second discussion leader is Hal Singer. He's an economist with Economist Inc. He's also a fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute. He's one of the go-to guys when it comes to analyzing the development of broadband markets and other telecom networks. So, over to you, Hal.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for the Internet Society for having me, and for Michael. Happy Halloween, by the way. It's a very big moment in our family. Michael and I just did a broadband jobs panel at Columbia University a month or so ago, and so he probably thinks this is all I do. Well, it's not. I actually limit myself to paneling, if that's what we're doing, to about once a month. I'm honored to share the stage with Blair Levin, a titan, in my opinion, in the area of broadband policy. And I know for a fact that pontificating on panels is Blair's full-time job. Now, before assessing Blair's policy prescriptions, let me share a little FCC data which I think informs, if not the state, at least the trajectory of broadband competition. You see, the FCC puts out on a semi-annual basis a study called the Internet Services Report. I commend you to go there and look at Figure 5A, not just in 1 year, but do it over a couple years, and you'll see something interesting. It shows you the number of households who are beholden to a single provider of wireline service at speeds capable of 10 megabits per second. Now, don't fault me for that one. That's the highest speed that they look at. But that's the only one that we can use for this comparison that I'm about to point out to you. If you look at the most recent report, which is now stale, the FCC doesn't move at lightning pace, as of December 2013, only 5% of U.S. households living in census tracts that were surveyed by the FCC were beholden to a single wireline provider at 10 megabits per second. 5%. It seems small, and I don't mean to diminish those folks. They're probably suffering. But let's compare that number to what we saw in earlier studies. In the end of December 2012, which is 1 year prior, we had 28% of U.S. households in these census tracts that were surveyed by the FCC were beholden to a single wireline provider at speeds capable of 10 megabits per second. And the comparable number for the prior year, December 2011, was 55%. 55% of households surveyed were basically beholden to a monopolist. So I point this out, and not to suggest that some panacea, but I do think progress is being made, and that if we want to focus on who needs help, it's the guys who are beholden to a monopoly. And that seems to be shrinking, at least with respect to the 10 megabits per second threshold. Now, there are a lot of things in Blair's prescription of how to strengthen broadband competition that I agree with, and so in the name of comedy, I'll begin with those. The first area is when he pushes back on Carl Bodie, who was wrong to dismiss the broadband plan and was also wrong to advocate for unbundling. Unbundling is absolutely not the right prescription, at least not where two or more facilities-based providers are competing. And economists who have studied unbundling have found that it zaps the incentive of incumbent providers to invest in new facilities. I just want to tell you two quick regulatory experiments that are on point. Recall that U.S. cable operators were not subject to unbundling in the late 1990s and early aughts, while DSL providers were. Presumably, cable guys had better lobbyists. And compared to telco investment, cable CapEx grew during this period at twice the rate of telco CapEx. And this ended in 2005, finally, when regulatory parity was achieved. Now, of course, not all of that difference in CapEx growth can be attributed to this asymmetric treatment. As Blair points out, Blair posits that cable companies were responding to the increased threat of DBS providers over this time. But it's certainly reasonable to conclude that at least some portion of the differential in growth can be attributed to the unbundling, the asymmetric unbundling regime. And one other quick experiment I want to tell you about, another regulatory asymmetry in Canada, where telco's investment in fiber to the node was subject to unbundling since 2010. But so long as they invested in fiber to the home, the newer technology, they were freed from the unbundling obligation. Well, guess what happened? The Canadian telcos moved out of the regulated fiber to the node sector and took all of their money out and moved it into fiber to the home. And as Blair recognizes correctly in his report, I think what this highlights is that regulation can matter. In this case, it can affect investment incentives. Now, as an aside, and something I'll come back to, the Canadian regulator just broke its promise not to subject fiber to the home to unbundling. In the summer of 2015, the CRTC reversed its policy of 5 years and extended the unbundling obligation to fiber to the home. You can imagine that after sinking billions of dollars in fiber to the home, in reliance on regulatory forbearance from unbundling, the telcos are less than pleased. Now, more on broken promises by a regulator in a bit. Now, another area of agreement that I have with Blair is the role of local government. Blair thinks that local government should incentivize market entry by private actors. I would only add that municipal entry could disincentivize private investment because no private entity wants to compete against a firm that is not interested in profit maximization. In contrast, and as recognized by Blair in his piece, incumbent ISPs react forcibly to entry by Google, a for-profit entity, by increasing their investment in network upgrades. Now let's get to some areas of disagreement just to spice things up. First, Blair says that the highest priority for broadband competition policy ought to be lower input costs. And I agree, input costs are important. But as Blair recognizes, the private return on investment in infrastructure is a function of both cost factors and demand factors. Some ISPs are presumably avoiding certain neighborhoods for upgrades, not because the costs are too high, but because the expected penetration rate is too low. Now, to stimulate demand and thereby encourage more entry, I want everyone to consider an end-user broadband subsidy, a subject relegated to a footnote in Blair's piece, paid not via a tax on broadband bills, as the FCC is considering, but instead paid via the general treasury. Now, a 2014 study authored by three FCC economists and one other person from Connected Nation estimates that up to 10 million non-adopting households would be willing to subscribe if a subscription discount of 15% were offered. Now, by my estimates, the annualized cost of connecting these households, these 10 million additional households, would be about $1 billion a year. And of course, if you wanted to go further than 10 million households, say $20 million, you would have to increase the subsidy by more than 15% because these are the guys who said no. And so it's conceivable that to get 20 million additional households, by my calculation, you'd have to go up to about $4 billion a year. Now, another area of disagreement. Blair appears to support Google's push to obtain access to video programming at a discounted rates, again in the spirit of lowering input costs. Now, it's not clear to me why programmers should be subsidizing Google's entry into broadband, particularly given the smaller market cap of the programmers relative to Google. Now, if the government wants to subsidize new broadband entrants with, say, a Dig Once plan, then do it. But don't ask input providers to pick up the tab. Indeed, price controls on content would perversely undercut the purpose of the net neutrality protections, which are aimed at stimulating investment at the edges and in content. Now, of course, I couldn't speak at an Internet Society event without discussing net neutrality, a potential problem in need of a solution. I say that to irritate my conservative friends. My solution is for Congress to give the FCC authority to regulate paid priority deals precisely as the agency wanted to in the 2010 Open Internet Order, namely case-by-case adjudication with a presumption that any such deal violates a non-discrimination principle. The D.C. Circuit, as you may recall, thought that this approach was tantamount to common carriage. So if you like this approach but you don't like common carriage, then the FCC needs a new source of authority. Now, in my opinion, Title II is an inferior solution, in part because it could scare off investment at the core of the network and lead to new state-based fees on broadband. I'm not going to talk about the fees, but I'd love for someone to ask me about those. Now, if you focus on the largest ISPs, including wireless ISPs, you'll find that broadband CapEx declined by about $2.5 billion in the first half of 2015 relative to the first half of 2014. Another outfit did a similar exercise, and they came to, with a different sample, it's a larger sample of ISPs, they came to an estimate of $1 billion decline. And the only real reason that we have for the $1 billion versus the $2.5 billion drop is the treatment of Sprint's capitalization of leased handsets. But I know that would cause your eyes to roll back in your head. It's a big number, okay? It's a big negative number. Now, of course, while I cannot prove that Title II was the cause of this decline, economists prefer to speak in terms of correlations, controlling for other possible things. It bears noting that broadband CapEx has increased in every year in the past 2 decades, with the exception of 2 episodes that were led by demand contractions. So this is unusual. Now, some have posited that we've reached the end of investment. But in a competitive dynamic such as the broadband industry, I just have to reject this notion. There's always going to be the next flavor. After 5G will come 6G. And others suggest that this decline is specific to AT&T, but I'll point out that Charter, Cablevision, and Frontier also experienced significant CapEx declines. Now, Blair likes to point out that ISPs never counted on revenues from content providers, and thus there can be no nexus between net neutrality regulation and the observed decline in CapEx. But this conflates net neutrality with Title II. I agree that ISPs are not thinking about foregone revenues from content providers. Instead, they are likely thinking about the prospects of the FCC's unforbearing, if that's a word, from the most onerous provisions of Title II, including the unbundling obligations. The FCC has already launched an investigation into the terms of telcos' rates for special access to middle-mile providers, and the agency has determined that unbundling obligations for business services that used to attach to analog technologies will now be forced to attach to IP-based solutions. And remember that broken promise from up north that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. In 2010, Canadian telcos understood that the regulator would forbear from unbundling fiber to the home technologies. Now, why would a promise by a U.S. regulator be any more secure? On what principled basis will the FCC maintain the promise to forbear from unbundling? Given that Title II is a prerequisite for unbundling, why else would the FCC reclassify ISPs as common carriers to enforce a non-discrimination rule when a less restrictive remedy was available? In my estimation, the telcos are properly hedging their bets until the uncertainty over Title II is relieved, hopefully by the D.C. Circuit in a few months. This is not a sky is falling scenario. It is a modest yet prudent pullback in investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hal. If I can have all my panelists up here, we'll now start the audience participation part. I heard a lot of agreement, particularly heard agreement on an equation which I can express as investment is inversely proportional to uncertainty. So the more uncertainty...
Not true, but there are a variety of things.
It's not the only thing we heard,
Yeah,
but there
right.
certainly is a lot of concern about the regulatory uncertainty and how that affects investment. So this is your chance. If you're online, we have a Twitter handle, IPF Broadband. That stands for Internet Policy Forum. And do we have a question already? You have a question, okay. And I have a requirement. Everybody has to introduce themselves before they ask their question.
Hi, David Viorst, ISOC, DC. Two
David.
questions. First for Blair. Doesn't the prisoner's dilemma assume no communication or lack of information between the two prisoners, and wouldn't that be not applicable to competing telcos or ISPs knowing what the other is investing in?
Well, the prisoner's dilemma game, the way it's generally played is that there is no communication.
Right.
But it then relates to the level of trust.
Right.
It probably would be an antitrust violation for the cable entities and the telcos to discuss their investment plans, but the truth is they have to discuss those things publicly so they
know them, though.
They know what their plans are.
Right, right.
But my point is, what we saw and what was obviously true was because cable had both the better network and the cheaper upgrade path, it did not make logical economic sense for the telcos to do the fiber unless there was some other change. That's
Okay.
my point. So it's analogous, but like all analogies, there's a certain imperfection.
And Halsinger, are you attributing demand retraction to Title II?
No. I'm saying that this decline in CapEx is an anomaly and that it's not being driven by a demand contraction. Instead, what I think it's being driven by is a concern among the ISPs that these promises to forbear from the most onerous provisions of Title II could melt away either with a change in political winds or whatever, and that because of that, they are reluctant to invest at the same levels that they did previously.
By the way, I disagree, Alan. I've talked about this before. I think first of all, I would never just look at one quarter to draw a conclusion. It's perfectly, I'm not saying there's something totally wrong about it, but I'm saying that's just not the way I would do it. Secondly, there are a lot of other things. Why Charter might be pulling back, does that have something to do with these $50 billion or whatever it is that they're spending on buying Time Warner, or why is it that AT&T pulled back, which, by the way, I think they reversed themselves in some part. They had announced earlier that they were going to have a lower CapEx because they were finishing up Project VIP, but also they spent an extra $10 billion on the AWS-3 auction, and of course they were also spending a huge amount of money on DirecTV.
Can I reply to that?
Sure.
Because
But my primary point, and I don't just show up at panels. I actually pay for Gig.U and the other stuff I'm doing by advising Wall Street on various issues. But one of the things Wall Street taught me is it's fundamentally about revenues and margins, and I don't see anything threatening those revenues and margins, and therefore I don't. Hal is right, but I actually think Wall Street and the companies fundamentally know the FCC is not going to engage in retail price regulation and unbundling. And those are the two. If they did, you would see a much bigger pullback. But you actually haven't seen a pullback in the stock prices attributable to Title II, and that's the reason why.
So stock price and investment. We have a question here?
Oh, can I respond?
Please
to that?
go ahead.
Yeah, Blair is fond of saying that AT&T has reversed itself. It hasn't. In October 22nd, AT&T released its third quarter numbers, and AT&T is $3.5 billion down from where it was at this time in 2014. But I don't want to make too much out of AT&T's or any particular companies. It turned out that when I looked at the top 7, 5 of the 7 went down in the first half, not in the first quarter, in the first half of 2015. But,
did you adjust the numbers based on what cable did the other day?
I haven't updated for the third quarter yet, but I looked again, and Charter is still way down. But here's the point: is let's not look at one particular firm, because any firm can fluctuate from year to year. Let's sum up all of the investment across whatever you think is a reasonable sample and compare what it is prior to the Title II regime. That's how economists do things. We realize that a lot of things are going on that could also change what's happening, right? But what's important to me is that, one, the aggregate decline is big, and two, it's unprecedented with the exception of 2 demand-led recessions or contractions. One was the fiber glut, where people realized that they were out ahead of demand, and they had to pull back. And then there was another recession, actual economic recession. But with those 2 exceptions, what we see is CapEx for the industry rising year over year. And people are, why do they keep doing this? Well, they're like little hamsters on the trail. You can't get off the wheel when your rival is upgrading your their network. And so you think that we're all going to be done with 4G. Well, what happens when your rival goes to 5G? You have to do it. You have to do it too. And so I think that the expectation should be that broadband CapEx, if we don't mess things up, should slowly increase year over year.
Okay. So, introduce yourself.
I'm Rob Pecoraro. I write for Yahoo Tech, USA Today, The Wirecutter, a few other places. This whole discussion is interesting because basically we have here a falsifiable hypothesis. At some point we should have enough data to say that yes, capital investment is down, or nope, it's resumed its growth. At what point will you two gentlemen concede that the other is right? How much data do you need to say, okay, Hal is correct on this, or nope, Blair had this right?
Let's look at the numbers at the end of 2016.
Unfortunately, the D.C. Circuit's going to have to go in December, right? And as an economist, I would hope that they would take this into consideration, this notion of cost-benefit analysis. The lawyers, my legal friends tell me that the FCC might not be subject to the kind of rigorous cost-benefit standards that are applied to other agencies. And so if they're not, then this is all a bunch of economists blowing hot air. But I think certainly you'd want to look into 2015 and 2016 as well.
So we'll schedule another session like this in about a year.
Well, I actually, there's a very specific reason I mentioned that. I think that, and this kind of goes to something that Jim was saying earlier about what he sees at the project level. I don't think we as a country actually are seeing the impact of the game of gigs yet. I don't think we'll see it till the end of 2016. Turns out it takes a long time for networks to be built. But I do believe that in 2016 we'll see something we haven't seen in a long time. You see it actually every day if you watch television every day, which is a marketing campaign between wireless providers. And it seems like every week another one is coming up with a different pricing plan. We haven't seen that kind of competition on the wired side, but in a certain select number of cities, in 2016, we will see it, and I think that's where and I think with AT&T committing to a very large number of fiber to the home, and then we'll see, the cable guys responding. We'll see.
Okay.
And I could be wrong. I do like the fact that I really enjoy chatting with Hal over the years and with Jim over the years. There are some people in Washington who simply have a narrative, and it doesn't matter what the facts are. The narrative is, the important thing is to have a consistency of narrative. I'm precisely the opposite. The important thing is to continually challenge your own narrative in face of new facts. And part of what I'm trying to do with this paper is saying, how are the facts different than they were 5 years ago?
Well, we picked the three of you because you not only have a good sense of what's going on in the marketplace, you have the numbers, you have the recommendations, and you have the stories. And so I want to turn to Jim and get a few stories of where municipalities have really done something that has spurred growth of broadband in their region. Do we have some cases around the country? We hear about Google Fiber, but there's a lot of other things going on out there.
Let me see if I can twist your question a little bit so as to enable me to take a swipe at Hal. Hal, I want to take issue.
No one's ever taken a swipe.
Yeah, well, I want to take issue with your statement that municipal entry discourages private investment because no private entity will compete with an entity that does not maximize profits. And I've got 5 answers to that question, or to that statement. The first one is that municipalities typically go to the private sector first and ask for upgrades or entry to meet the needs of the community, and don't go forward with a project if the private sector says yes. Once the municipalities do, in fact, invest, what we typically see are that all around the community in question, rates continue to go up, service remains at the levels that it does, but within the municipality where competition now exists, the incumbent rates go down or don't rise as fast, quality of service improves, and the environment to the residents of the state of competition is better for everyone. Third point is that there have been hundreds of communities that have invested in one way or another in public broadband networks, several hundreds of them, and I'm aware of only 2 situations in the last 20 years in which private sector entity sold its system to the municipality and left the market. In most cases, what the private sector does is stays, improves their services. We have a statement, for example, from Comcast, from a representative of Comcast upon the entry of Tacoma into the market, that their entry strengthened Comcast because it caused Comcast to improve its system, improve its services, and so on and so forth. Now, when one talks about municipal investment, I think one also has to change what that investment profile is. We have seen across the country a surge of interest in public-private partnerships, and concomitantly we see much less investment of a community alone. And the public-private partnerships take many different forms, but it's still a form of public investment as well as private investment. And I personally think that this is a trend that will continue to grow, particularly as we see successful endeavors of the public and private sectors working together.
Can I respond?
Al?
So I was waiting for you, and I think I may have heard one anecdote that spoke to my conjecture. Let me just say it again. The conjecture is that once the municipality goes, it could disincentivize private entities from upgrading. And this, by the way, isn't just a conjecture. There's a paper by David Sappington, pretty famous industrial organization economist, that lays out the theory and then points to examples in regulated industries where this has happened. And so what I was expecting you to say is, I can think of 5 cities in which, after the municipality went, the incumbent responded the way that they're responding to Google by upgrading their networks, right? I'm not hearing those stories. Blair tells a bunch of great anecdotal stories about almost every time that Google goes, the incumbent is forced to respond with a faster network of their own. And what my conjecture is that you would see the opposite effect where municipalities go, because the private actor recognizes it doesn't take a PhD in economics. That I don't want to be in a campaign against this guy. Right? If he's going to cut rates below cost, why would I want to stick around? I also want to point out there's a study by a graduate student at the Mercatus Institute that showed that there was no appreciable employment effect in cities that had built up municipal networks, and the author gave some interesting examples as to why not. But again, if I'm right and it's disincentivizing private, then this author's results, that is, no private sector employment effects, would be consistent with the notion that what the municipality is doing is chasing away private investment.
Well, I'd encourage you to read a paper by George Ford, now with Phoenix, and writing typically for industry-oriented positions. But he studied this phenomenon and wrote a paper about a study he conducted in Florida indicating that municipal investment, in fact, increases investment in the community. If you look at investment by all sectors, not just the telecom sector, rather than drive capital out of the community. And we do see investment. Incumbents are not giving up the ghost and saying if a municipality invests, they're going to lock up shop. All across the country, there's investment happening. Cable companies everywhere are up. They upgraded to DOCSIS 3.0 in Lafayette, Louisiana. Cox made Lafayette the very first place where it rolled out DOCSIS 3.0, and there are examples of that all across the board. It is indeed hard to track the economic development effects of broadband investments of any kind, public or otherwise, but we've published a paper with 17 case histories of examples of how communities benefited, increased jobs and otherwise, from the public investment that occurred in a municipal network.
So we have yes, no. Blair, do you want to be a tiebreaker here?
I'm not sure I'll break the tie in this way. I would say if I were in Congress, I would vote for a law to preempt any state from restricting municipalities. If I were on a if I was in the state legislature, I'd vote against any law restricting cities. If I were on a city council, I would always threaten to do it, and I would almost certainly vote against almost any actual. In other words, I see it very much in the kind of negotiating realm, and I think basically my view is as I said, the point of public policy is to drive abundant bandwidth. The state laws that are restricting it, give us worse or more expensive, slower bandwidth, and therefore I think a city should have the right. However, I would just say two things. First of all, in the year 2011 and 12, those years, I spent a lot of time going to cities, talking about Gig.U and meeting with various people, and we were planning this thing. Two things were almost inevitably true. Number one, shortly after I left, like within 24 hours, the incumbent telco and cable operator would call up the mayor and say, "What can we do for you today?" In other words, and the same thing was true of my friend Milo Medine, who was then running Google Fiber. If you published, we were joking, if you published our travel schedules, we might get the upgrade we're working.
But that was in response to a private entity.
Well, but it was also it was not clear what we were doing because we were agnostic on the Gig.U. None of the projects actually involved real municipal broadband, as the term is often known, but it does involve certain municipal actions. It just doesn't involve the investments. But there are certain projects that I'm actually quite fond of where the city is doing certain kinds of infrastructure, like laying dark fiber and then leasing it to the private sector and stuff like that. I'm just saying, I'm actually publishing a blog at Brookings in a week or two, talking about the 4 different kinds of communities, those that either can or will probably get Google, big cities that have scale and staff but will never get Google, smaller communities, like a lot of the Gig.U communities, and then really rural that don't have scale and don't have density. But there are examples in each of these where cities have successfully gotten broadband. What I was going to say, the second thing that is almost true, always true, is when mayors really think about the difficulties of doing this, most of the ones I dealt with did not want to do a pure municipal project. Very difficult to attract talent, to run it, subject to kind of technological risk that city projects usually aren't. And you need to raise money that's fundamentally different than the money. I used to actually be a bond lawyer, raising money for a parking lot or a sewer system. Cities know how to do that. Raising money for a more for a business that is changing with technology, that is much tougher. But that's a legitimate debate. I debate people on it all the time. And if depending on what city you're mayor of, you might have a different point of view on it.
By the way, your point on what it means to have the ability to step away from the table and the impact that can have is almost identical to a point that Franklin Delano Roosevelt made in a very famous speech in Portland, Oregon in 1932 when he was running for president on local choice as his platform.
I know I stole it from somewhere.
So you just brought up
There's another question behind you.
Okay, I had a question about presidential politics, since you just mentioned Roosevelt. I've been surprised in this campaign that so far we haven't seen a lot of talk about broadband and the next generation of technology and all the great things we could do with e-government. Do you have any explanation for that? We've had a little talk of net neutrality, but in terms of talking about the vision, which Clinton did, Obama did, there was a lot of talk about what we could do if we really wired the country, or wired the world.
I don't really think we saw that in the campaigns.
Pardon me?
I'm not sure we saw that in the campaigns, but I'll accept that. And I'll say, look, I think everybody in Washington, D.C. at the end of October ought to recognize that whatever they thought about this presidential campaign in June did not turn out to be true. So, like, what do we know? We're all idiots. But I would simply say one of the things that's really striking to me is this does seem to be a certain kind of what I think professionals refer to as a grievance election. That is to say, the candidates who are doing well are those who articulate grievances. Grievances are fundamentally backwards looking. And that, I think, creates a great opening, if someone knew how to do it, for a forward-looking candidate.
Yeah.
To say, here's how we, you got to love Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again." He keeps talking about how we're losing in the world in which I operate. It seems like America's winning everything in the world, but okay, I'm looking at a small piece of it. But the point is, he is backward looking in how he talks about let's make America great again.
My response is in two parts. First of all, at the local level, this is a nonpartisan issue. Most of the communities that have developed networks have done it for economic development. That's the single most important consideration that's cited. Most of those communities vote Republican, many heavily so. So at the local level, this is not a partisan issue at all. At the national level, Hillary Clinton last week declared that she was in favor of preemption of state barriers, supports network neutrality, is opposed to monopolies in this area. In a perfect world, we would like to see municipal or local choice even more so than any particular exercise of that choice, be a nonpartisan issue at the federal level. But because Hillary has said something, there will undoubtedly be others taking a different view of it, and hopefully we can have a constructive conversation about local choice at the national level as well.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just note that. Can I note while he's walking back that Hillary in her blog in Quartz said that 3/4 of Americans are beholden to a monopoly provider. I don't know where she got that stat from.
I know where she got that stat. And
It was very provocative.
No,
It wasn't true. It was provocative.
I don't know whether to blame Eric Garr or Steve Rosenberg, or I'm mentioning people in the plan who are friends, and we've been chatting about this. When we did a slide presentation in September of '09, and we had 150 slides, it was a 4-hour meeting. We were actually trying to get a factual basis before we went to do policy analysis and make recommendations. The slide I worried most about was this slide. It was, I can't remember which number it was, but it said at different speeds, you have different numbers of choices. Factually unobjectionable. But what I worried about, what everyone would say is, oh my God, he's setting up for unbundling, or you're setting up for some kind of price regulation, which was not the point. We were simply making a very important point that at 25 and above, 75% of Americans had only one choice, which is about the number it is today, roughly speaking. But anyway, it turned out nobody noticed that slide because the slide everybody focused on was the one that said if we want to get all Americans 100 megabits, it'll cost $300 billion.
We noticed the slide and blasted it all over the country.
Well, other people, but there was absolutely nothing written about it. But Tom Wheeler picked it up in last September. Salet picked it up. Baer picked it up. The president picked it up. But why it took 4 years for people to pick it up, that's an interesting question, which I will not discuss. But it was an interesting case where at a particular moment in time, some things get picked up. I would say I think that 75, this is what I mean about the difference between today, look where the puck is going. A couple years from now, that slide will be obsolete.
But you're saying that it hasn't changed that much in the 4 years?
No, I don't think it has.
I don't think it's at 75%. I saw the slide because Chairman Wheeler used it at a speech in 1776.
Yeah.
And it's not 75%. I think it was something like 50-something percent, but it was already dated by the time that he gave it. It was a stat as of 2013 or something.
It may be true because of the U-verse stuff. I don't know that. But it will change dramatically, I think, in the next 2 years.
Well, factoids are dangerous.
It gets the people going.
Then you'll find a higher number.
Yeah, of course. We'll have to redefine it.
Well, but look, and this is why I say we need two networks that basically have abundant bandwidth where you're making changes on the electronics, not on the trenching. And once you get there, I think we'll be in pretty good shape.
Okay.
All right. I asked this question as a member of either that 50% or Blair's 5%. I'd like to ask you guys, to kind of think about comparing areas or localities where there's lack of competition or one ISP or one wireline to areas with municipal broadband. In those areas, is investment in infrastructure, how does that compare? And how does the rate that consumers pay for, per megabit of bandwidth compare?
Yeah, let's focus on the price side first, because that's the one that's most immediate.
Well, I'm not. I know a lot about the communities I've worked with. I'm not going to do studies, but I will tell you this. One of the things that's really interesting and amusing is we are creating a new digital divide, but it's not the digital divide that people think about wealth or even density. Pointed out the other day in a speech I was giving at NATOA that the big digital divide is between Starkville, Mississippi, a fundamentally rural town, and Bethesda, Maryland, a much wealthier place where I live, or Beverly Hills, or Westchester County. Starkville has 2 gigabit options at a lower price than I would pay for like 50 megabits. And the reason is because C Spire went there and an incumbent upgraded. And what you see in the what Google is basically telling us is by the end of 2016, 17, there are going to be a number of communities that have 3 options. Now, there are a number for affordable gig. Most of the couple hundred communities that Jim is talking about, correct me if I'm wrong about this, are fundamentally rural communities who really don't have choices. That's not an area that I tend to work in. But my point is, there are different ways of getting up the mountains. But what you're going to see in a couple years is you're going to have communities where you're paying about $70 for a gig, which makes it really pretty damn hard to sell 50 megabits at $100. So you're going to have downward pressure on pricing in those communities. And indeed, Google also offers a very low entry-level price. It's very different, right? They just offer two places where 2 price points, whereas the incumbents have a bunch. They're pricing differently in a more traditional manner when you have scarce goods to get to kind of the profit maximizing point. And there's nothing illegal or immoral or wrong about that. But it's really cool when you attack with an asymmetric asset base and asymmetric incentives because you change the pricing dynamic. Well, what I would say is every community has an opportunity to improve its situation, but there are four very distinct strategies in my view. That's a longer issue, but there is no community that I'm aware of that is out of the game. It's just a question of whether they want to organize to be in the game.
So Jim?
Just as a matter of fact, pricing strategies of communities that have networks are all over the place, depending on their particular philosophy. Some believe that they are the people and should charge the customer base the lowest that they can charge, consistent with keeping their networks upgraded and paying for service and so on and so forth. Their philosophy is that the more money they leave in the community, the more it can circulate in the community, paying for haircuts and soccer cleats and other communities don't compete at all on price and are higher than the private sector price, but their approach is to compete on quality of service, friendliness. This is particularly true of those communities that are out of the tradition of providing their own electric utilities. They filled gaps in the market a century ago and carry forward the same philosophy into the communications area, and then there's everything in between. So there's no particular pricing strategy that I'm aware that could be called the dominant strategy. It's a matter of local decision making, what works for that particular community.
Okay.
Name's Will Reinhardt, American Action Forum. I actually did do one of those studies looking at the overall prices that were for each of the different municipal services, and even though I need to go back and do it again with a more robust regression analysis, my initial findings was about 20 to 50% higher. Now, of course, there's other issues that obviously need to be taken into consideration.
What was 20 to 50% higher?
20 to 50% higher for municipal broadband prices per megabyte as compared.
Prices were.
Yes, as compared to, and I use I can show you this later if you're interested. But I went through about 100 and I think there's 140 consumer-facing municipal broadband projects. A very significant portion of them actually are more on the business side. So I was only just looking at consumer side in that regard. As compared to two indexes, or three indexes that I had. So I looked at the price that, OTI, I think they do a paper almost every single year looking at average prices over cities. So I used that. And then I also used the Ookla. Ookla has an average price index as well. So I can send you this information if you're interested in it. We've talked a lot about we've talked a lot about supply today and supply issues. I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit more about demand. The reason I asked this is because George Ford in another paper actually did a very interesting study looking at stochastic frontier analysis. So he did an OLS model, really simple regression, then took another look at it through stochastic frontier analysis. And I don't know if he necessarily proved, but he at least indicates that a significant portion of broadband speeds, I think it was on broadband speeds, is connected specifically to the demand side. And the one thing that he points out in the paper is that, for all of the benefits of that occur in the U.S., one of the really big problems in the U.S. is that our consumption of computers is in fact very, very low, and that you actually have a broad variability of consumers on the very bottom end, which you do not have in other countries, specifically in Western Europe. So in that paper specifically, he said that he sees it much more of a demand issue than a supply issue. And I was just wondering if the panel could talk a little bit more about demand problems. This is much more on the digital divide, which we haven't really talked about, and it's kind of opens up a can of worms, but it's also the other side of it, which Hal talked a little bit about.
Yeah, I'll talk a bit. Brian Fung did a nice piece in Washington Post recently looking at the demand factors, and of course there are some folks out there for whom price is just not an issue, right? And there are different strategies that you need to do to try to increase their demand for broadband. But there is a healthy chunk for which price is the impediment. And if that's the case, I think that we should move aggressively to try to bridge the divide between what the suppliers can sell at and what these households can afford. And I do think that if you can increase the expected penetration rate among entrants, I mean, this is the fundamental problem. The Wall Street Journal is going crazy about this, how cable seems to be gobbling up, in terms of new subscribers, cable seems to be gobbling up a disproportionate share of new subscribers. You're probably familiar with these stats. And of course, if
That's because television is so much better than it used to be.
I don't know about that, but whatever it is, if you're an entrant and you're sitting there and you're watching the new subscribers go up, to the cable, it's going to affect your expected penetration level, and that in turn is going to affect your incentive to want to make the plunge. And I think that we could solve perhaps two problems with one stone here if we think hard about a broadband subsidy, an end-user subsidy that would bring in somewhere between 10 and 20 million new homes. That could make investment that could alter the investment calculus for entrants in a way that I think would be very positive.
We have to get you in touch with one of the presidential candidates' speechwriters. Ms. Blair?
First of all, I really appreciate whenever you do these things, there's two kinds of criticism. There's the kinds where you go, oh, God, that's so stupid. And then there's the kind where you go, well, that's thoughtful. And I think that is a thoughtful point about it. I'll tell you why I don't address it here, but except to say, and there's a footnote in the written thing, that there is a vision about bandwidth abundance that I've had for some time. I think things like E-rate reform, lifeline reform, connected home are all totally consistent with that. And I think Wheeler deserves a lot of credit for what he did on E-rate. Hopefully the commission will do help bring lifeline into the 21st century. I think what connected home. I think these things are really good. What I was focused on was how do you drive an upgrade? And I would say that if you were to, putting aside Google Fiber and Gig.U and the other kind of the three levers I talked about, you take them out of the equation and you add a number of new subscribers, that would be very good for the country. And I would be in favor of that. It's not going to happen, but at least Hal and I would be in favor of a general subsidy to bring more people online. But I don't think you change the competitive dynamic. That doesn't necessarily lead AT&T to want to upgrade because they get those people, because they're more likely to get those people because they're going to be kind of the Walmart in this equation. It's kind of the Walmart versus Bloomingdale's, and the country, most new buyers are going to Bloomingdale's apparently. So that's kind of the challenge. And I would just say that what I'm kind of looking for is that situation where we have what we have with long distance voice, where most people in this room can remember where you actually thought about making a long distance call, but our kids don't ever think about it. And so how do you create bandwidth abundance that drives the price and the value to a point where nobody thinks about it? But it's a very worthwhile debate, and I certainly appreciate those who say, and they said this at the beginning of Gig.U, why are you wasting your time doing this? We ought to be focused on how do you get 90% on, and your point about computers is right, which is that part of the reason we have lower adoption in Western Europe is we have lower adoption of computers. But that's just not where I was focused with this paper and with some of the work I've done.
Can I just to distinguish, this is really important actually, it's where are you going to finance the subsidy, right? And if you do it under the Lifeline program, you're financing it on the backs of the broadband bill, right? Now, can you imagine?
Actually, you're not. That's a bit, but eventually
no, you
get there.
You are. You impose the fee on the provider, and the provider turns around and puts it on your broadband bill. Now look, which is exactly how they do it for voice, as you know, the Interlata services on voice. Now,
right, but it's the same factor right now.
Okay.
It's the same.
Right. So let me just finish this. Can you imagine if we said we all recognize that general R&D is underprovided because of positive spillovers in the economy, and we want to subsidize it? Let's tax producers of general R&D. Right? You'd think I was crazy. I mean, I'd be laughing, and yet that's the way that we're heading on the Lifeline plan. But not only is it perverse in the sense that you're going to raise the price of broadband service with federal fees. As soon as the government goes, as soon as the federal government goes, we're waiting for this board decision, and Commissioner Rosenworcel said we're going to delay the vote until after the D.C. Circuit. And my interpretation of this is that they are concerned that if they vote and we get new federal USF fees that attach to our broadband bill, then the preemption that was put into the 2015 Open Internet Order. It's in the 400s, paragraph 477. Just do a search for preemption. The FCC preempted the states from moving forward with their own USF fees unless and until the federal government moved forward with theirs, and they noted that the joint board was deciding. This preemption goes away as soon as the FCC and the feds move with their own broadband tax, right? So the second wave that's going to hit consumers are state fees. And fortunately, I've got the Vermont chairman of the Telecommunication Task Force saying that he's champing at the bit. He's champing at the bit to go with a state-based fee, but he can't do it right now because of the preemption.
Okay.
Can I just say, I'm
Sure. So, Jim?
I think that we're talking about two important issues that don't necessarily coincide. It is important to enhance adoption and use at one end of the spectrum, but at the same time we have an upper end challenge that also needs to be met. In our preparation for this, we talked about whether to get into international comparisons or not. I won't get into comparisons with Europe, but China has gone from nowhere to, at the very least, half the world's fiber connections at this point. And we can't, like the Chinese government, declare that all new connections shall be fiber. But if we're going to remain a great country, we have to find our own ways to be competitive at the upper end as well. So while it is critically important that we focus on adoption at all levels, we can't lose sight of the need to find ways to invest in upper end advanced communications networks.
I would just make the point, the point you're making is really about the contribution factor and the way we do it and the way it might transition. And I would just say, I actually, like most economists would, I mean, I'm not an economist, but at the Aspen Institute every summer we have this session and we have a bunch of economists, all of whom always recommend that USF be funded by general taxes, and that makes total economic sense.
That's why we never get invited back to cocktail parties.
Right. But I would note that the majority of the Universal Service Fund goes to fund networks, and nobody would fund a network if it thought it was subject to an annual congressional appropriation. So I think Hal is making an important point, but I think, as we think about the political reality of these things, network funding, anchor institution funding, and low-income funding are kind of three different buckets.
Well, that goes back to my equation about uncertainty.
Yeah.
Political uncertainty being even greater than
But it's particularly true
regulatory
when we're talking about
uncertainty.
CapEx
Right.
as opposed to an OpEx.
Okay, we have lunch waiting for us, and I think people are eager to try out what's waiting for us, but I would like to give you each the opportunity to summarize your critical point, the take-home message, in a tweet. So if you have, I heard Jim's tweet, which was "Watch out for China," but do you have another simple one sentence that you'd like to just leave people with?
I support local choice, and I believe that at the local level, this is a nonpartisan issue, and we'd love to see it nationwide, a nonpartisan issue.
That was 156 characters. Very good. Blair?
Actually, I don't think I have a good tweet. That's why it took me 4,500 words in the written version. But I would just say it's about the plumbing.
That's even
and that
shorter.
we have to focus, actually, one of the things I said in the written paper is a lot of people in politics make what I think of as the fundamental aspiration error. The fundamental attribution error is the correlating outcome with in time, but the aspiration error is to think that you've actually done something if you state an aspiration. Mm-hmm. It's really about plumbing.
Yeah. And your paper is available in its entirety with the slides at our website, isoc-dc.org. So the last word is yours, or the last numbers if you want to use some numbers in your tweet.
Do I have to do it?
You have to do 140 characters.
How about make love, not war? End the war in the telecosm, and let's find a compromise on net neutrality that Congress can support and move about our business.
Okay. Thank you very much, and we'll have conversation over lunch.
Thank you very much. That was great fun. Thank you.
That was fun.
Yeah.
And I hope I didn't